Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the National Landcare Conference 2021 to the Environment and Climate Change stream. And before we start, I would like to encourage all participants to please submit your questions to the question box that you see on the screen. Now, our speaker for today is Peter Holding from Farmers for Climate Action. So I would like to now over to you. Peter, would you like to start your session?
Thank you, Jan. Good afternoon. Firstly, I'd like to let you know that I'm coming to you from Hard, New South Wales, which is Wiradjuri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and to their emerging leaders. So I thank them for that. Today I'm going to take a quick journey as a way of explaining things that has taken my lifetime to learn and I'm only now starting to understand. Firstly, to give you an idea of how little I've moved around, I live in my grandfather's house on my family's farm, and I've lived pretty much all my life in this area. I went away to university, but so I have a fairly great attachment to this little part of the land. So at the end of this journey, I'd like to leave you with three key messages, and they are that resilience involves strong connections with your local community. For this reason, Landcare and other community groups are now more important than they've ever been. I'd like to suggest that to bring the change we would like to see requires an effective voice, and that can most easily be achieved through working collaboratively with wider community groups like Farmers for Climate Action. And the window for action on global warming and thus climate change is closing rapidly. If we are not to be diverted from action on this and to stop the greenwashing, we need to recognise and end the false equivalence of geological carbon emissions and biological carbon emissions. This is critical when it comes to sequestering emissions. So without further ado, they're the things I'd like you to get out of this, and we'll move on. So my journey in farming commenced in 1979, just 2 years before the 1981-82 drought. Many will remember the dust storms that it brought to Eastern Australia. Due to our lack of understanding of the environment at that time and also economic factors, we failed to reduce stock fast enough, and we were still conventionally cropping at that point, which led to massive environmental decline and soil degradation. So things obviously had to change. We started experimenting with direct drilling, stubble retention and better grazing systems. This led to the search for knowledge and the formation of the Hard Murrumbidgee Landcare Group in 1990. This group, just yesterday, I was talking to them, and they now have 300 members, and they've just completed its next 10 years strategic plan. By this time in 1990, we were along the way to totally direct drilling and using stubble retention. And in 1994, we did a holistic management course and started cell grazing along the Allen Savory method. By mid-2000s, I was starting to experience declining annual rainfall, extended droughts, more severe fires. And all of this, although the management changes we implemented were helping to alleviate the impact of this. Again, in a search for knowledge, I was selected to join a group of farmers travelling Australia looking at managing climate variability. This was known as the Climate Champions program. This was at a time when the climate language war was raging inside government. We went from anthropogenic global warming at the start to not being able to mention climate change, and we ended not being able to talk about anything but climate variability. This program was government funded, and when we asked the Liberals at their annual conference to take climate change more seriously, they did. They promptly cut off our funding. And this in the end was a good thing, as it made many of us fight harder and commit to action on climate change and global warming. This led to the formation of Farmers for Climate Action, when we met in the Blue Mountains and formed a working group and moved on from here. I hope you are seeing a pattern here. You can't succeed alone. You need to be in a group or in groups of groups to firstly draw out the knowledge required and then to develop an effective voice for change. So what is to be done? So enter the white knight. And sorry, white knights don't exist, and we'll have to do something else, maybe build community resilience. And so enter Farmers for Climate Action. Now, Farmers for Climate Action supports farmers to become climate leaders, drive change across the sector, and collectively influence government to implement change-friendly policies that benefit rural communities. The FCA is committed to helping farmers learn more about climate science and policy and communicate with the public about climate change. Farmers have a critical role as they are frequently recognised as some of the most trusted voices in climate change in our society. They are also at the front line of climate change. The FCA's approach to climate action is, 1, evidence-based and informed by the best available science, collaborative, inclusive and respectful, and independent and politically non-partisan. FCA recognises people living in regional and rural Australia and remote settings understand the implications of a changing climate and are at the forefront of the movement for robust climate action. To this end, FCA has released 2 landmark reports, Change in the Air, defining the need for an Australian agricultural climate strategy, and Regional Horizons, farming communities leading the recovery. They're available on our website, farmersforclimateaction.org.au/whatwedo/reports. We will be releasing a 3rd major report being prepared at the moment by EY on pathways to net zero for Australian agriculture. It will be released next month. The first report was unanimously accepted by the Agricultural Ministers Forum, otherwise known as AGMIN, and is currently being driven by the Victorian Ag Minister and her department. The second informed the $5 million Commonwealth investment in the Future Drought Fund and the formation of the drought resilience hubs in 8 rural universities. It's also helping to drive the development of renewable energy in rural areas. So, the bottom line. Finally, as carbon emissions continue to rise, it is my view that the window of opportunity to take action on global warming is rapidly closing. The time for action is now. I see a large danger in rushing to carbon sequestration if at the same time we try to continue business as usual and fail to move away from fossil fuels. This would be particularly egregious as we have the technology to do this right now. I'm concerned that we are not seeing much urgency in this country as we run up to COP26, which will be close to our last chance to get action that might be implemented before 2030. We need to see, at the very least, a redefining of carbon accounting rules that remove false equivalence of geological and biological carbon. If this step is not achieved, we will see the proliferation of greenwashing carbon sequestration schemes, whereby fossil fuel industries or users will continue to try and sequester that carbon released through agricultural methods. And there's no similarity, really. These schemes only allow the continuation as usual of burning fossil fuel and the long-term accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. So we need to do everything we can to on-farm to sequester carbon emissions, and we're supporting that as much as we can. However, this will be futile unless we move away from fossil fuels. It is not the flow of emissions that matter in the end, but rather the amount accumulated in the atmosphere that leads to anthropogenic global warming. Unavoidably, we need to do more. So I'm suggesting, 1, we need to join and support your local community groups to build your resilience in the face of these climate change impacts. Communities with good connection between its members are much able to withstand the climate emergencies such as bushfires and floods as compared to those that are more insular. 2, we need to develop a wider effective voice for working collaboratively with other groups and or join Farmers for Climate Action. And 3, we demand a science-based approach and at least end false carbon equivalence of geological and biological carbon. Do not be seduced by short-term financial gains for long-term destruction. So we'll now take questions.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Peter. That was really inspiring, and it must be challenging within giving the political and also the actual physical climate must be very arid and droughts you mentioned and things like that. So without me waffling, let us see. Okay, now first question here is from Robin. Robin asks, why is it that farmers continue to vote for political parties which deny climate change?
Yeah, I get this one all the time. There is roughly about 90,000 farm businesses, and I think there's somewhere in the vicinity of 135,000 people who identify on the census as farmers. Given that they're scattered over all the electorates, that's a very small sector. There is a problem in the sense that we need to get the rural communities and many people thinking about climate action. I guess they feel threatened, whether that's historical or what it is, but it's not really farmers continuing to support the National Party. I think it's just the way the communities are, and as part of our role, we're trying to educate rural communities on how to make their vote count. I'll give you an example. We did some research after the Upper Hunter election, the by-election the other day, and it was a optional preferential voting system, and the Nationals got 32% of the vote and won the seat. There were at least another 5 independents that got between 10 and 14% of the vote, but didn't swap their preferences, and consequently, preferences didn't flow, their votes were exhausted, and they didn't get the result they wanted. So there's a lot of education to be done.
Okay, fantastic, Peter. Thanks very much. The next question is from Sophie. Peter, how have you sustained your own energy and enthusiasm through so many years of inaction?
Well, I think you get burnout, because burnout used to be a big problem in Landcare with unrealistic expectations. I can sound a bit depressing at times because I don't have a high expectation that governments are going to do anything. I just rely on the community work that I do, and that's what I mean by building resilience. You build resilience by talking to your community and working with your community and doing what you can where you can. So you don't get burnt out.
Awesome. Okay, then a comment. I hope John Anderson was watching this, so that's a comment. Then another question. Oh, is anyone else having sound issues? So that's not maybe related to this content, but important. Jonathan asks, does the FCA include seaweed farmers for producing fodder for cattle to reduce their methane emissions?
This is an interesting one, because the Asparagopsis seaweed is a big hope for the cattle industry. Yes, we support the research. We are not in favour of damaging environments, and so there'll be, before this is rolled out, I suspect there'll be a lot of debate about how they're going to get the seaweed and where it's going to be grown. I suspect they'll end up synthetically producing it, so I don't think that's such a big problem. And then they've got to get it into the cattle, which is another issue. So yeah, there's a lot of research still to be done on that, I understand.
Okay, cool. Now, Pamela is asking, can we spread the idea of regenerative farming more widely, which includes carbon sequestration, better water practices, and biodiversity?
Well, I totally agree. That's what we've got to do. Not all farms are grazing farms, though, so there's different issues there. But I think many farmers are doing that. They may not call themselves regenerative, but they are definitely moving to regenerative practices. It's a really difficult one. I would prefer to see farmers cooperating together and learning from each other and doing what they can, rather than the sort of tribalism that's going on with some of the issues about whether you're traditional farmer or whether you're a regenerative farmer or whether you're some other sort of farmer. Like all these things are designed to separate us and make us a less effective voice.
Okay, that's a very interesting take that you shared there. Now, next question is from Eric. What can we advocate for to help support farmers in transitioning to more sustainable practices?
Well, I hope that's going to be in our next report. I move to net zero. Many farmers are already doing pretty much what they can. We're trying to encourage environmental repair and increase biodiversity, because fundamentally farming depends on that. So I guess if I could suggest anything, it is looking around your farm. Most farms, I would think, could find 10% of wasteland, be it a creek line or a hilltop, rocky areas, whatever, and use those areas to build up your biodiversity and repair them, replace vegetation. Not a lot else they can do. They can, and many are, set up renewable energy systems on their farms. I'd like to see a lot more work done on the grid so that we could connect into that and provide cheaper electricity for people who don't have the capacity to put panels on their roof, or they rent houses or whatever else it might be. But there's a lot of people that don't have the capacity to do that. So farmers could provide that power for them.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. Now, the next question is from Anonymous. Is there any opportunity to influence large agriculture business?
Yeah, there is actually. Well, anybody that's operating as a company and has a board are now required to take consideration and inform their shareholders of what they're doing for climate action and how they're going to combat it. So I would say that just becoming more public, voicing your views, joining your Landcare group and making your position known, I think you'll have an impact. It's a slow impact and it needs consistent, constant pressure, but it can have an impact in the end.
Okay, fantastic, Peter. Now, the next question is from Joff. Are many farmers pursuing carbon credits through the ERF? We have found it cost prohibitive for farms in southwestern Victoria, particularly smaller acreage farms.
Yes, and I would totally agree with that assessment. No, there is not a lot of, most of the ERF funds have gone to avoided deforestation. So if you have permission to cut a forest down, you can go to them and say you won't cut it down and lock it up and get paid. But for farmers themselves, the soil testing and various other things are cost prohibitive. We're working on a system now, and I can't really talk about it because it's still being dealt with in the New South Wales government. But under their net zero plan, we're looking to do things like plant trees. And as you would all know from the koala habitat discussion that happened about 6 months ago, they map all that stuff. And so they know how many trees you've got. So we can pretty much from satellite technology work out what you're doing in that area. So the costs will come down considerably. The question then is whether it's better for you to sell your ACUs or whether it's better to keep them and use them to make your own business net zero.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Peter. Now, the next question is from Ella. Can you please tell us a bit about how NFF, MLA, other peak ag bodies are responding to FCA and how government is responding to FCA's message? Do you think it's effective yet?
Well, that's a matter of degrees again. Yes, it's effective it's too slow, but it's effective in the sense that we've now got the NFF in 12 months to move to a net zero by 2050 position. Obviously, it ought to be 2030, but we're working on that. We've got the bus moving, if you think about it like that. Maybe we can get it to a different destination. But MLA, well, they're working. They've all got a net zero policy. I'd say the biggest problem is we need to get rid of some of the false equivalents, because most farmers understand that their emission cycle, and yes, they have to be responsible for them, and yes, they need to plant trees or do do some other method of sequestering them, but it's a short-term cycle, and therefore the risks of planting trees is considerably reduced. So yeah, I think we're being effective. I'm not sure we're doing it fast enough. That's my biggest concern. I think the window of opportunity will shut before we get the job done.
Okay, thanks very much. Now the question here from Chris. How do you pressure the big supermarkets to take imperfect fruit and veg to reduce food waste?
Well, that's an interesting thing. I think what's going to happen there, I mean, most of these and like the previous question, how do we influence the ag bodies? It all comes down to people getting motivated, and instead of sitting in the pub and whinging about things not being done, join their local group and get activated. You know, if you're in a town like I'm in, say the next biggest town is Young, it's got a big Woolies in it, got a couple of supermarkets. Imagine if everybody in that town said, we're not having this anymore. It'd change overnight. But the trouble is everybody doesn't want to come together at this point in time. So I would only encourage everybody that's listening to this to join their local Landcare group at the very least, or FCA, or any other group that thinks they can have a voice, and start being noisy.
Okay, awesome. Peter, the next question we've got is from Melanie. Have you considered using biochar?
I have considered using biochar, and we looked at make your own oil, and we looked at biochar. The problem with biochar, well, there's a couple of problems with it, but the main one, the problem with us, is getting enough raw material and transporting it to us. The cost of transport will prohibit the use of it pretty much. It seems to work, the research that we looked at seemed to work up the north coast where there was plenty of rain, but it's not such a viable product the drier it gets. So I don't think it'll work for us particularly, but we have tried using human waste from Sydney. We've tried using fly ash out of the incinerators in ACT. We've tried all sorts of things. A big problem with many of those things is simply the cost.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Now, do you have any representation in Western Australia, Peter?
We do. There's an organisation over there which we help set up and we sort of collaborate with now. It's called Net Zero 2030. Simon Warwick is the chair of that organisation. And I'm sure he'd be happy to take your call or sign you up or give you information.
Fantastic. We have 3 more minutes. So, one more minute. Now, question from Geoff. Farmers comprise. Another question. How do you feel, because it got more votes, how do you feel as a farmer on the ground that is witnessing the impacts of climate change, hearing from people such as today's keynote speaker that it's basically all scaremongering?
I can't believe that there was a keynote speaker that would say such a thing. I guess you're talking about John Anderson. Would that be right? Well,
I don't have that visible.
I can't make people change their mind. I would ask them to look at the science. And when people tell me things like that, I normally look at what their business is. And if you happen to be the chair of a gas company, well, probably that's how you feel, because it's going to have to cease.
Okay, we have time for one more final question, and the question is from Costa. I second this question for people in this space. Peter, how have you sustained your own energy and enthusiasm through so many years of inaction? So, sorry, you've already answered that, haven't you?
I've already, yeah.
Apologies, that's my mismanagement. So let's just go one final question. Hang on. Okay. Farmers comprise 2% of the workforce versus 30% 5 decades ago. Does this explain the lack of political support and therefore funding to support farmers to sequester carbon?
Look, there's a whole lot of issues that have to be confronted in agriculture. we are losing the core of our farmers, that is the family farms. So we're being left with niche farmers. Nothing wrong with that, but we're left with niche farmers around towns that most people work off the farm and have another job, or we're being overrun by large corporates. Now, there's nothing wrong with that either if that's what you want, but that'll empty out the rural communities even more. So I think we need to have a long, hard think about how we want agriculture in this country. I think we need to have a think about our food security. There is currently droughts in America, Canada, Russia, floods in other countries. Wheat prices are up to $380. Canola prices are up around $780 a tonne. Won't be long before a loaf of bread costs $10. And when that happens, the poor people in this country are going to start realising that their food isn't quite as secure as they thought it was.
Okay, that's very good. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for Peter. It was so informative. And thank you very much, everyone, for asking questions. And thanks for Peter answering them. Awesome. Now, I would like to encourage everyone who wants to join the next session. It will start in 5 minutes here on this stream. And thanks very much, Peter. And was awesome to see you. And we'll see you next time.
Thanks for everybody who turned up. Thank you.